All right, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. So, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for tonight's virtual program. My name is Pat Kane, Public Programs and Visitor Services Coordinator at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. And thank you for coming tonight to tonight's program, another program as part of our annual Garden Speaker Series. I want to especially thank tonight's guests. Ken Robertson and Jack Zinnen, who we will meet in a few moments, for joining us to discuss native plants and using them in your home garden. Before we get into tonight's program, I did want to go over a few housekeeping items, let you know what's coming up at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, and of course, introduce you to tonight's special guests. So first and foremost, if you haven't done so already, down in the comment section below, let us know where you are watching from tonight by writing your location down in the comments. We got quite a few people doing that already, tuning in. Got 75 people tuning in on my end so far, which is great. Thank you so much for tuning in. But we have folks tuning in tonight. Karen from Mahomet. I got folks watching from Bloomington, Illinois, Charleston, Illinois, and Coles County. Sarah's tuning in from Champaign. Kate tuning in all the way from Minnesota. Benjamin tuning in from Urbana. Dee tuning in from Pontiac. Dwayne from Bettendorf, Iowa. Emily tuning in from Northfield, Minnesota. Mary all the way from Lawrence, Kansas. Leslie from Mahomet. Mary from Mahomet. Becky from Peoria. Jesse from Quincy. David from Normal. Ann from East Peoria. Debbie from Sylvania, Ohio. And we have so much more folks from Arkansas, Iowa, and even more from Central Illinois. So thank you so much for tuning in tonight. And again, if you haven't done so already, let us know where you are watching from by writing it in the comments section below. A little bit about us, if you don't know anything about us. The Museum of the Grand Prairie opened originally in 1968 as the Early American Museum, and our current mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret the cultural and natural history of Champaign County and East Central Illinois for all current and future generations. We're part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, which is a collection of 7 forest preserves right here in Champaign County in East Central Illinois. We also have 2 educational facilities, including our museum, as well as the Homer Lake Interpretive Center at Homer Lake Forest Preserve. We have a golf course, Kickapoo Rail Trail, and so much more in the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. Tonight's program, as I mentioned, is the second program in our annual Garden Speaker Series. And the series is virtual for the first time ever. We're coming to you live on our Museum of the Grand Prairie Facebook and YouTube page. Each month of 2021 from January until April, we're providing virtual presentations in this series. And with a large amount of time everyone is spending at home these days, the theme for this year's Garden Speaker Series is How to at Home, with programs focusing on how to garden in various ways within your own home or on your own property. Our next program in the series is going to occur on Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, again, right back here on our Facebook and YouTube pages, where Jill Taylor, Champaign County Master Gardener, will present the program titled How to Plant a Garden for Pollinators. Again, that program is on Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Other things happening throughout the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. If you're looking for an excuse to get outside this winter and explore, we encourage you to participate in the first ever Champaign County Forest Preserve District Snowflake Search. We've hidden 30 beautifully and creatively painted snowflakes throughout our forest preserves here in Champaign County, along with some fun facts next to them, talking about local cultural and natural history. And we encourage you to try to find all 30. Venture out into the forest preserves this winter, have some fun seeing what you can find. And we also encourage you to, once you find a snowflake, snap a picture and post that to social media using the hashtag CCFPD Snowflake Search. And of course, explore safely. It's been pretty cold here lately, so make sure that you are exploring, finding those snowflakes as safe as you possibly can. I also want to encourage you to stay tuned to the Museum of the Grand Prairie social media pages throughout the month of February, because this month is Black History Month. We are celebrating local Black history and local Black history makers throughout the month by sharing their stories on our social media pages. Also, February is Abe Lincoln's birthday month, so sharing a lot of Abe Lincoln related stories as it relates to Abe Lincoln's time in Champaign County. So check out the Museum of the Grand Prairie on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to find those awesome stories of Black history and local Abe Lincoln history. For more info about these programs and everything else happening at the Museum of the Grand Prairie and Champaign County Forest Preserve District, I encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and YouTube, or visit museumofthegrandprairie.org or ccfpd.org. Again, want to encourage you to let us know where you're watching from tonight. Got more folks writing down below. Devra tuning in from Champaign. Hey, Devra, familiar face. Travis from Lincoln, Nebraska. Karen from Beeson, Illinois. Janet all the way from Oklahoma. Michelle all the way from Kentucky. Julie from Palos Heights, Illinois. Donna from Rantoul, Illinois. My mom. Hey, Mom. Andy from Columbus, Ohio. Jan from Rantoul. And Joyce from Urbana. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Got 92 of you tuning in so far, so really appreciate you all tuning in virtually tonight for tonight's program. All right, so enough of me talking. Let's bring on our special guests tonight for the program, and I'm going to introduce them and turn the show over to them. So I'm going to bring on Ken and Jack. Ken and Jack, how you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so Ken and Jack are here to talk about native plants, the exciting things surrounding native plants, and I'm going to introduce them really quick. Let's see. So first, I want to introduce Ken Robertson. Ken Robertson is a retired botanist from the Illinois Natural History Survey and Department of Plant Biology at the University of Illinois. He received his BA and MS from the University of Kansas and a PhD from Washington University and the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis. He came to the Natural History Survey in 1976 after spending 6 years at the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard University. Ken's parents were florists, and he has always been interested in all plants, both native and cultivated. At the Natural History Survey, he worked with native plant species and natural habitats, especially prairies. He regularly presents units on botany and prairie to master naturalist classes and taught or co-taught the plant systematics course at the University of Illinois for many years. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. And also introduce you to Jack. Jack Zinnen is a doctoral candidate at the University of Illinois in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. Jack studies plant ecology, native plant conservation. Jack has expertise in seed production for restoration, plant community assessment, as well as native plants in the commercial trade and their availability. So without further ado, let's give a warm virtual welcome to Ken and Jack. Thank you again so much to you two for joining us tonight. I'll turn it over to you. All right. Let's see here. Ken, would you mind? Looks like I lost your shared screen. Would you mind sharing your screen again? Coming back to our broadcast.
Oh, that's not working again.
Oh, we're seeing your screen, Ken. And if you could just go full screen.
Yeah, let me try that one more time.
Well, if you just go back to our
Share screen. Share screen. Entire screen.
Here we go.
Does that work?
Oh, and then if you could just make your PowerPoint go full screen, Ken.
There.
Perfect. All right.
We're good?
We are good.
Okay, good. Good. Well, tonight's talk is how to use the diversity of native plants in your garden, and I emphasize garden because Jack and I both work with natural ecosystems, and if we were giving this talk on what plants to use, if you're restoring a prairie or a woodland something, we'd be talking a very different kind, we'd be giving a very different kind of talk than we are tonight, which is about growing native plants in cultivation. Now then, when people think of Illinois, they sort of think of two things: large urban things, urban areas like Chicago, or in the fields of corn and soybeans. But there is a lot of natural diversity to see in Illinois. Illinois is a big state. The northern border of the Chicago-Wisconsin line, the Illinois-Wisconsin line, is about the same latitude as Boston, Massachusetts. The southern state, limit of Illinois, Cairo, Illinois, is about the same as Norfolk, Virginia. That's a lot of distance from north to south. And we have a lot of diversity in our state in terms of plants and biodiversity because of that distance. So up the northern part of Illinois, northeastern Illinois, you have the Illinois Beach State Park with these beautiful sand areas and sand prairies along Lake Michigan. We also have various kinds of wetlands in the northern part of Illinois. There's an open water bog with acid, very acid water and acid-loving plants there. If you go to the northwestern part of the state around Galena, it's called the driftless area. It escaped a glaciation, and you have northern plants that occur along the like Apple River at Apple River Canyon State Park. And the western border, the entire western border of Illinois is the Mississippi River. And you see beautiful bluffs along the Mississippi River up in Mississippi Palisades State Park. You see the various hill prairies and all kinds of sand prairies, a lot of diversity along the whole Mississippi River. And then there are forests. Illinois was originally about 60% prairie and about 40% forest, much of the forest in the northern part of the state and in the Shawnee Hills in the south. But we do have prairies in the Midwest too, and two of them, what were called prairie groves, which were islands of prairie, islands of forest surrounded by the prairie. And so there's a lot of towns in Illinois that have the word grove in them, like Downers Grove or Sugar Grove, things like that. And so these are two examples. One is Funk's Grove, south of Bloomington, and another is Brownfield Woods, which is owned by the university as a research tract northeast of Urbana, and it's a remnant of the Urbana Grove that occurred here. Then there are savannas, which is sort of prairie-like vegetation, plus some unique plants that are found in various parts of the state with an open canopy of trees with prairie vegetation underneath. And of course we have prairie, beautiful prairies, and a large number of prairies, and we'll be spending much of the talk talking about various prairie plants. Prairie was not all monotonous. We had the black soil prairie that you see there. We also had sand prairies and hill prairies. And then when you get to the extreme southern part of the state, you have one of the most biologically diverse parts of the state in the Harlem Hills and LaRue Swamp in Union County, and then the beautiful bald cypress swamps such as you see here at Heron Pond. So there's a lot of diversity here. Okay, Jack, go ahead.
Yeah. So my name's Jack Zinnen, and there are about 2,000 native species to Illinois. As Ken was telling us, Illinois is a very long state, and it's very interesting from a floristic perspective. Up in the Chicago area and down in the southern tip of Illinois are where you could be, or where you could consider kind of the hot spots of native plant diversity in the state. But nonetheless, Illinois is quite diverse, and there are over 2,200 species, and that includes like native ferns, conifers, and then wildflowers, which we call forbs. And what's very interesting is, and this is something I'm working on for my dissertation, about 1,000 of those are available in the commercial trade. So something that's very exciting for people, including people like me who really care about native plants, is that if you know where to look, you can get your hands on all kinds of different native species. And it makes it a very valuable and rewarding thing to be interested in. Ken? Yeah. So this talk is about native plants in your garden. So it's important to define what a native plant is. And a native plant is basically a plant that was indigenous to a specific delineated area historically. And historically is a word that I like to use because it's important to think about history. So what was here prior to European settlement in particular is very important to think about native plants when you're talking about Illinois in particular. And I'm actually very shocked. We have a lot of viewers from all over the place. And so defining a native plant will vary depending on where you are. A lot of people define native differently. So in a garden setting, a lot of people will say a plant will be native if it is native to the Midwest. But it is really up to you to define what native is, because there are a lot of nuances to it. So some people might go to the county level to define nativity. Other people may say a broad region like the Midwest, as I was saying.
Now, what is a native plant when it comes to gardening? And this would be a very different, as I mentioned, this is different from what you would do if you were restoring a prairie or a woodland. But many native plants have become domesticated over time. We've selected them for certain traits that we want for plants that we grow in cultivation. And so, such as height or width or form or flower or leaf color or ornamental fruits, or maybe you want a plant that's fruitless and disease resistance, all kinds of things like this that people have been selecting for thousands of years, really, over time, to select certain traits of wild species that we want to emphasize in cultivation. And we call these cultivars, which is cultivated variety. And the rose piece is perhaps the piece is in single quotation marks, and that indicates that it's a cultivar name. And so we give these cultivar names. Now, some people use the word nativar for a cultivated variety that is derived from a native species. And cultivar is an official naming category. Nativar is not. But they are all cultivars. But there's a variety of sweet gum that you see there with a very slender columnar shape, and that is simply called slender silhouette as a cultivar name. And we're going to be talking a lot about cultivars because many of these cultivars are better in a garden situation than if you were to use, say, just the wild species, the original species, or what you would find growing in nature nearby. But each gardener, again, just needs to decide how acceptable you want cultivars. And I think the happiest people are those that don't worry about that too much. So, Jack, you want to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. So why use native plants? In Illinois, I would argue it's really important to garden with native plants. As Ken said earlier, most of the state has been transformed into agriculture and or settled areas. So really, it's important to introduce biodiversity on the local landscape, which in many people's cases, the yards and their gardens. And something that I really like to emphasize is native plants in a garden setting don't just act like non-native plants in that they're pretty and that they make your house more interesting, but they also fill very important ecological and biodiversity roles. So native plants form the basis of the food chain for insects, birds, mammals, and other critters. And not only that, but they also are very beautiful and charming, and it's a very rewarding hobby to get into. So Ken and I both have prairie gardens at our house, for example, and it's wonderful to just go outside and not only look at the beauty of the native gardens, but to see all the biodiversity that you attract, all these weird insects, all of the birds and butterflies, for example. So I find it very rewarding, and I encourage people to think of native plants not just as aesthetic, but as biodiversity on your landscape. And similarly, there are a lot of native plant species which behave very well in garden settings. I think a lot of people have this mentality that they're wild species and they go crazy when you plant them in a garden. But as we said earlier, there are over 2,000 native species in the state, and there's an entire gamut of behaviors in the garden. And I would argue that many native plant species behave even better than many of the non-native cultivated species.
Example of this. How many of you, you can't raise your hands because I can't see you, but I'm sure a lot of you watching tonight have been out trying to control the non-native bush honeysuckles, which are just so pervasive in our woods these days. And the one reason it is so invasive is that it's good for birds, and it produces lots of delicious red fruits that the birds love to eat, and then they spread the seeds around all over the place, and the plant becomes very invasive. There is a native honeysuckle. It's called a bush honeysuckle, but it's the native honeysuckle, the Diarvilla lonicera. And it's a good plant. It has these beautiful yellow to orange flowers, and it's a small shrub, 3 or 4 feet tall like that. Lovely fall color. And in the picture, if you can see the cursor on your screen there in the lower right-hand corner, this is a native plant. This is on the U of I campus, University of Illinois campus. And this is a penstemon, a beard tongue right here. Here is this native bush honeysuckle and a red maple in the background. So there's all native species growing along this building. And just behind me over my shoulder is a large planting of switchgrass. So it's all natives. Jack?
And similar to what I was saying earlier, native plants combine aesthetics and functionality. And a good example here is butterfly weed. And Ken and I chose butterfly weed because, well, one, I think it's just very attractive. It is this beautiful electric orange color. And butterfly weed is actually very popular in gardens. In fact, for one of the studies I've been conducting, butterfly weed is basically the most common native plant in cultivation in the entire Midwest. So it's something that maybe some of you in the audience have either heard of or are growing right now. So what is it about butterfly weed that's important? Well, not only is it beautiful, but it provides food to pollinators, such as the monarch butterfly, which uses it as a larval host plant. And it has these like milkweed seeds. And for example, birds will actually take that fluff, the pappus, from the milkweed seeds and use them in nesting. So there are all these biodiversity benefits, not just beauty, that reverberates to other animals. So I think that's something very important to recognize. Something that I'm very interested in too, that I just like to talk to everyone about, and Ken and I had a discussion about this, is that native plants have these very interesting aesthetics, and there's a variety of textures that can be used in your garden depending on what you want to do. So we have 3 species here, and they're just examples of different textures and different architectures that you might consider. Purple lovegrass is this very beautiful purplish grass, and it's wispy and diffuse, and you might plant it like in the background just to give kind of like this nice shade of color. Blazing Star is a beautiful prairie plant that has this gorgeous spike of pink blooms. And then silphiums, which we'll talk about later, they're these massive and very striking plants that go very well as almost this specimen plant in a garden setting.
Okay, we have to, this talk we basically divided up into talking about some native trees, some shrubs, some woodland wildflowers, and prairie plants. Now that's a lot. And so I'm really not going to be spending much time on trees, and then we will be talking about a few native shrubs, and then a few of each of those categories. A lot of plant, we are going to go through quite a few species here, so we're not going to spend too much time on each one of them, but the idea is just to give you a palette, something that you can think about, and each of these species you can look up later on and find out more information about them on the web, and also this PowerPoint, our presentation tonight, will be available later on, and you can go back and look at some of the things if you can't, don't have time to write down everything. So in the top trees in Champaign are those 5: red maple, sugar maple, silver maple, northern red oak, and swamp oak. Those are the 5 top trees along the streets in Champaign. And Champaign-Urbana is a very pretty town. We've lived here 40 years, and there's a lot of cultivated plants growing on campus as well as in the yards around town. It's a very nice place to live. And these native trees, they do provide shade and privacy and landscape attractiveness. And there's some others that we have listed here. And these are all native to Illinois, not necessarily Champaign County, such as bald cypress or red maple are not found in the wild in Champaign County, but they're commonly cultivated. Now, sugar maple is one of the more commonly cultivated trees in town, and probably the vast majority of the sugar maple trees that you find growing around town are of the wild type. They would be the same kind of genetic makeup as you would find in the wild trees around town too. But they are all known for their beautiful fall color, of course, as for their collecting the sap in the springtime shortly now to make maple syrup. And it takes 5 of those gallons to make 1 pint of maple syrup. So think about that next time you're pouring some real maple syrup over your waffles or something. But but there are some cultivated varieties of them. There is this one that you see up on the upper right-hand corner here. It's simply called Globus. That's the way it stays. It hasn't been pruned that way. It's a relatively small tree, and it's a cultivar called Globus. There's several local people in Champaign-Urbana, or in Illinois, I should say. They're very keen plantsmen and have noticed plants in cultivation over time in nursery rows, and they selected for certain traits. And one was Will Wandell, and he selected a variety called Legacy that has really tough, thick leaves that makes it less prone to wind tatter and things like that. Now, if you like our native shade trees, but you don't have room to grow one in your yard, well, there are these cultivated varieties of some. One's a sugar maple called Gold Spire, it still can get 40 feet tall or more. Some of these can. And there's that sweet gum called Slender Silhouette. And pond cypress is a relative of bald cypress. It occurs, pond cypress really doesn't occur in southern Illinois probably, but it's certainly related to bald cypress. And there is a columnar form called Prairie Sentinel, which is kind of an odd name since it occurs in swamps and doesn't have anything to do with prairies. Another plant I really like is sassafras. And it's just beautiful, gorgeous fall color. Is it available, Jack?
Yeah, sassafras is available. But generally, it's one of the trees that you would consider rare in cultivation. But I want to emphasize to everyone that if there is an obscure native species, odds are you can find it if you know where to look. But sassafrasses don't transplant well, so people typically sell them as very small trees that you have to be very patient with. But if you look at the fall color, I mean, it might be worth the wait.
Another nice tree is red buckeye, which is native to a half a dozen counties in southern Illinois. It's a small tree, and it has these really beautiful, lovely red flowers that are pollinated by hummingbirds. And so it isn't very commonly cultivated. Jack, you want to say availability?
Oh, in terms of availability, this is another tree that you can find in cultivation commonly. This is one I would call occasional. You would probably have to go to a fairly large nursery or a wholesaler to find this. But yeah, this is one that's fairly popular due to its red flowers, and you do see planted around occasionally.
Redbud. Many people grow redbuds. It's a lovely tree by itself, and the truly vast majority, 98% or so of the trees, the redbud trees you see growing around Champaign County or anywhere in cultivation are of the wild type. They look just like the trees that we have in cultivation with these lavender pink flowers and the heart-shaped leaves that are green and lots of fruits, and those fruits do flow up, the wind blows those fruits all over the place, and that means the plants come up all over the place too. It's not terribly weedy, but I mean, they will come up, and you just have to keep sprouts coming up all of the time. But this is what you see in cultivation, but look at what's available. These function just as fine as well as our wild type that we have, but there's wonderful variety of colors. Withers Pink Charm and Appalachian Red, there's one of those at Parkland College along Bradley. Tennessee Pink, and then there's a white version too of it. Another placement, a person at the University of Illinois, Joe McDaniel, introduced this Royal White as a cultivar. And look at the variety and habit, the growth habit. You can have weeping ones such as Lavender Twist. Down below it is Forest Pansy, which is fairly common. And you see it along the streets, in yards along Champaign-Urbana streets. And it has these sort of purplish leaves that stay that color nearly all summer. And then you combine the purple leaves with the sweeping habit, and you have ruby falls like that. And then you also have hearts of gold. I've seen ruby falls a few places in Champaign, for instance, like that. So there is a lot of variety. If you want something different and you still want a native, well, go for some of the cultivars like that. They function just as well as a native, and they're interesting and something different and nice to look at. Another small tree, they're either a small tree or a shrub or a large multi-stemmed shrub. The serviceberries or Shad Bush, June berries, there are several species of amelanchiers involved with these. Some are hybrids, but they all, ones you see are mostly going to be natives, derived from natives. And they have these beautiful white flowers on them like this, attract pollinators. And they produce these, they look like blueberry fruits that start off as sort of pink, well, green, then the pink color, and then finally to red, to purple when they're fully ripe. And birds usually would, well, when they're ripe, when they're purple, it's a signal to birds to eat them. But you'll know the cedar waxwing over there is eating these. Somebody didn't tell him that you're supposed to wait for them to turn purple, and he went ahead and ate some of the red ones anyway. And these June berries, the shad bushes, turn the most beautiful colors in the fall too. And this is an example up in Minneapolis. It's at the American Swedish Institute, and they have a modern wing on the building. And along this wing is a glass windows here and a row of these Amelanchier bushes, here small trees, what you wish to call it. But along here, this is side oats grama that is growing. And on the background here, you have prairie drop seed. It's a lovely, and coming through the drop seed, you can see the flower heads or the seed heads of an echinacea, the purple echinacea that's coming through there as well. And there's some geraniums and other things in there. But it's a nice combination of using native plants that really very striking to look at. Now, I like witch hazels. And they're just common. This is a beautiful, there's several of these examples on the University of Illinois campus. This is the one that flowers in the fall, not the spring, but this is the one that flowers in the fall, and it is the one that is native to Illinois. It flowers late in the fall. The flowers are just incredibly fragrant, and they're really quite beautiful. And this will flower up into December, and sometimes we'll get an early snow, and you'll get snow on the flowers of the witch hazel, but when the snow melts, they just continue on flowering as if nothing happened. And so, can you get this, Jack, the Native American witch hazel?
Yeah, witch hazel is fairly common in cultivation. And the next species we're going to look at is too Ozark witch hazel. They're both relatively common as you can buy them as fairly large shrubs too. So I would encourage people to look into these if they're interested in some type of native shrub in their yard.
Now, one of the most widely cultivated hydrangeas or shrubs is Hydrangea arborescens called Annabelle. On the right, you can see what the typical Annabelle Hydrangea arborescens looks like. It looks like this. But back in 1910, some guy was riding through horseback in southern Illinois in Union County and found something that looked like this. He thought that's nice, so he took some plants, dug some up, and took him back to his house. And it got spread around, and in the little town of Anna, Illinois, Joe McDaniels happened to notice this in people's yards. And it was really nice, so he introduced it and named it and introduced it into cultivation. And it's grown all over the place. You ask Australia, New Zealand, South America, as well as Europe, North or Southern Hemisphere, and that where you have a temperate climate, you see this lovely plant of Annabelle. But there are some other hydrangeas that are useful too. Now, I'm going to be stretching the limit as to what is native here. But this is showing along the side of our house. And we have an oak leaf hydrangea, and back behind it there is a gorgeous Bottlebrush Buckeye. Now, oak leaf hydrangea is commonly available in garden centers. There's a lot of cultivars of it. It is slow to become established. That's a quote that I heard someone was giving a talk about hydrangeas. This plant just sat there for 5 years, and then it's suddenly taken off, and I have to cut it to the ground every 3 or 4 years just to kind of keep it under control. But it's a beautiful plant, and it's native in Tennessee along the Mississippi River and other places in Tennessee. It doesn't really get to Illinois, but I like it. And it's great for pollinators too. And that flock, these are sterile flowers around the outside. The true flowers are on the inside down here of the flower clusters like that. They have this beautiful peeling orange bark, and they're really pretty in the winter. Just to see the snow hanging off of the dried flower heads like that. It's a very pretty plant. Now, this is Bottlebrush Buckeye. Now, this one is native in the southeastern United States, but it's not the nearest place, maybe Alabama or Georgia for this. It's not really native here, but it does quite well here. And that plant's probably nearly 40 years old, but it's just a striking plant. I just put in one plant, and it's over 20, 25 feet long, and these beautiful tall spikes of white flowers. And it has a fragrance at night, and it attracts as pollinators night flying moths that visit it like this. So are both of these available?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, these are available, both of them, and fairly common.
Okay. Now there is a cultivar that Joe McDaniels has introduced into cultivation. He named it for Dr. Ronald Rogers, who was a mycologist or a fungus expert at the University of Illinois. And it has these weeping inflorescences rather than those taller X spikes. It has these weeping ones. That's the main library, south side at the University of Illinois. And it's planted around. Personally, I don't care for it. That's just my personal opinion like that. But it certainly fills that space nicely. And that view, like that picture, is quite an attractive picture, I must admit. But I'm not terribly fond of the plant. But hey, that's just me. And we, as people, we all have our favorite plants and we have our least favorite plants. Now I'm switching over to some spring woodland wildflowers. And one that comes up really early is Bloodroot. And I love to watch it come bursting through the ground about the same time as snowdrops. And these lovely little white flowers. And then later in the season, the flowers disappear and they produce these little fruits that split open to release these seeds, these bronze seeds on the inside. And what's interesting about it is those seeds have this little fleshy coating along the seeds. And ants come along and will collect these seeds and then take them around and bury them in the ground. They eat the seeds and then they just leave the seeds to wherever they carry them. So this will come up in the middle of the yard or something like that. But you know, I'm over, but that doesn't. I don't mind that. Ants will spread them around like this, and it's interesting that insects are responsible for pollinating so many plants. But when it comes to dispersing seeds, insects have almost no role, very little role, but in this case, it is an insect, an ant, that disperses the seeds of this. And if you cut the stems off, you see that why it's called bloodroot, that it's in the poppy family. It has this red fruit like that. Another spring woodland wildflower that is really nice in gardens as well as you see it in the wild is Virginia bluebells. And I can't remember if I took that picture. I think it was at Funk's Grove that you see of the large patch of it there. But I have it in the other pictures were taken in my backyard, and they do very nice in shade in the springtime. They flower a little bit later than the bloodroot, for instance, like that. But they have these lovely flowers, and the flower buds are pink, and the flowers turn blue as the flowers open and mature. And this will kind of spread around. It spreads underground and maybe from seeds too. I had one clump that just sat there for years, and I think it needed to be pollinated by another plant. And so some enterprising bee or butterfly visited another flower in another yard somewhere and brought in a different pollen and pollinated my plants, and now it spreads. Other pretty spring woodland wildflowers, Dutchman's Britches and squirrel corn. They're both species of the genus Dicentra, and they're lovely little plants with these fern-like leaves. And the Dutchman's Britches have those flowers like this, like you see up there. And this is squirrel corn like this. Jack, do you have anything to say about this plant?
I would say squirrel corn isn't really found in cultivation as far as I'm aware, but Dutchman's Britches you can find sold occasionally. And something just as a quick note, as Ken was saying, like not only are these woodland wildflowers very beautiful in terms of their flower, but a lot of times the leaves of these plants are just gorgeous and kind of make a show on their own, including like the bluebells. Yeah.
Another favorite is wild columbine. These are pollinated by hummingbirds. One of a suite of species that are pollinated, that have red flowers in eastern North America, that are pollinated by the ruby-throated hummingbird. And we saw the red buckeye as one example, and this is another one. This flowers in the spring, the wild columbine. Yes? Okay, and so these flowers hang upside down, so they're readily available for pollinators to visit. This grows very nice. They have it along the patio, and there are some white pine trees in the backyard. You may not be able to see it here, but there's a little leaf miner, a little insect larvae that burrows into the leaves, and it looks almost like variegated leaves later in the season. But hey, that's providing habitat for an insect that's native, and so that's fine. Now, one thing to avoid when you're dealing with cultivars of native plants is to avoid double-flowered ones. because these are just basically worthless to an insect to pollinate or something like that. They may be pretty and attractive. They might be hideous to some people, but it depends. If you want something different, yes, but don't plant cultivars or of any kind of double flowered kind of any kind of a native plant, because they really that's where you're interfering with their role in nature, and even if you're using nature in your backyard. And here's an area with wildflowers. You don't grow them so much as individual plants. They're nice to have a cluster of them together, but you see them in the wild, they often grow together and things like that. And so this is off the patio, and this is called Sweet Cicely and Wild Columbine. There's a wild geranium here, and over here is a celandine poppy with the lovely yellow flowers to it like this, and Solomon seal up here. And then down here is this starry Solomon seal, which you see over here. And just where this plant here on the left, just to the right of that, I had a big patch, lovely growing patch of starry Solomon seal. The problem is that this has bright red berries that the birds just love, and it came up all over the place. And so I got rid of it. It took a long time to get rid of it. Jack, do you have anything to say about starry Solomon seal?
Not particularly. Someone in the comments asked if these are all shade, and yes, we're talking. This section is about woodland wildflowers, so they can go in deep shade, but they can also go in part sun and generally do okay. And keep in mind, these are all going to be available at native plant nurseries and be able to be found.
Another is goat's beard, Aruncus, a diocus. This is a taller plant, nice wildflowers. When you're going to grow it in a garden, you want to be sure, and most of the plants that you do buy are going to be male plants. There's actually separate male and female flowers on different plants. But be sure and buy the male flower plants, because they are the ones that have the big fluffy, showy inflorescences, and the female plants are not nearly as showy as this. Now that I'm talking to prairie plants, we have a lot of prairie plants to show you, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. But what do you do with prairie plants? Well, the top two pictures I did not take. They're from the Royal Horticultural Society garden in Wisley, England. And they built a new greenhouse complex, and it's designed by a famous Scandinavian landscape architect. But many of these are Native American plants. I can identify purple coneflower in there. There are others in here. But one possibility when you're using native plants is grow them a whole bunch together. We had a sort of an idea of this with a project called Corridors for Tomorrow that I was involved with a long time ago. And the idea, when you're driving down an interstate and you're putting prairie flowers in, if you just see a mass at 70 miles an hour, you don't see much. But if you were to pull those species apart and say planting 100 feet of pale coneflower and 100 feet of prairie dropseed, 100 feet of goldenrod or something like that, it would make a better statement. It never got implemented, but this is kind of that idea like this. And so this is growing species, large numbers of plants of the same species growing together. It's very ornamental in a very formal way. But this is also at Wisley, and this is pale coneflower that we have here. But it's growing with a relative of Rattlesnake Master, but not our native Rattlesnake Master. But it's just growing in mass with other species. And in many garden situations, it's perfectly fine to grow our native species with non-native species. And there have been, I know especially in England with the RHS, they have funded studies that have shown that in terms of attracting pollinators, you're better off if you grow some non-native species and native species together. Now, this is an example at the Chicago Botanic Garden, these two places here, taken at different seasons, different years, but showing what you can do, with just native species here, prairie dropseed and golden Alexanders and shooting star, things like this, coming up early in the spring, all native prairie plants growing together, and then you try to get the complete sequence of prairie plants through the seasons like this. You're not necessarily clumping them together, but you're trying to create in a landscape setting what the natural prairie looks like. And Jack came up with this term a while back called vertical heterogeneity. And if you look up here at the Wisley Garden, you don't see any vertical heterogeneity. you look at a natural prairie and you look at a garden situation like this, you do have vertical heterogeneity, which adds a lot to a prairie. Now, as Jack mentioned, we both have little prairies, and this is by our front driveway. It changes a lot over the years, but there's a lot of different species growing together. A lot of different species growing together, as you see there. There we go. But you see the vertical heterogeneity in here. This is compass plant, and here is prairie dock in here. And so you have this vertical heterogeneity that is growing there. And there's the oak leaf hydrangea there. And my wife likes zinnias, so there's a lot of zinnias that are growing there, which are non-native. But it actually works out very well because in the fall, there's a lot of the tall goldenrod and New England asters and things are flowering here. And the silphiums up here, they're all sharing pollinators. And there's huge numbers of monarchs and other kinds of insects on both the zinnias that also spill over onto the native plants as well. It works out very nicely that way. Now then, this could either be it likes wet areas that could be shaded in a woodland, or they could be out in a wet prairie. The cardinal flower, another one of these hummingbird pollinated plants that does well in cultivation, and it will spread in cultivation. This is in a neighbor's backyard where it just grows and seeds freely like that, but who cares, because it's such these beautiful red flowers. Now there is a native prairie plant, it will really be a woodland wildflower called the great lobelium, which is blue flowers like that. Now another red flowered plant is this one, Silene regia, or the royal catchfly. Gorgeous prairie plants. This one is very rare in Illinois, and it is it is on our state endangered list. It's illegal to sell this plant if it came from wild origin, but most of the time it is, Jack, it is available, right, from certain nurseries where it's from non-native, not Illinois type seeds, right?
Yes, this is one that is found in cultivation. And sometimes when you buy these things from garden centers or nurseries, you're never really sure where the seed source is from initially. So I would wager that when you buy these in cultivation, they're probably from Missouri sources, but it's hard to say.
Sure, but it's a beautiful plant. It attracts hummingbirds. Another plant that's a favorite is Queen of the Prairie, and this is also the same as it is on our state endangered list. It's very rare in Illinois in the wild, but it's very commonly cultivated in cultivation. There are cultivars of this. One is called Venusta, and it's commonly cultivated in many parts of the north temperate region as well. But beautiful flowers. It's 3 or 4 feet tall, something like that. And it does tolerate some shade. It does best, though, when you have it out in full sun, and it does like some wet areas. And Don Gardner's pond that you can see here has it, and he has in his yard at the house where he lives a beautiful large clump of this, which sometimes appear in the Grand Prairie Friends plant sale, actually, as offshoots from that. And then in addition to that, it's a gorgeous plant. He does have it in his prairie as well, where it becomes established in his prairie. Now, another plant is wild petunia. This is a plant that grows along, it likes edges. And the big pictures at the Morton Arboretum, actually. The Morton Arboretum has on their pond area by the visitor center. They have some nice prairie plantings, and this is wild petunia. It's not related to real petunias at all, but it's this low plant, a foot tall. It's along my driveway prairie. It's a very pretty plant, but it does spread, and it spreads seed readily, and it's come up in the neighbor's yard across the street and all kinds of things like that. So it's a pretty plant, but it does spread. Oh, another favorite of mine. This is the Missouri evening primrose. And it's technically not native to Illinois proper. I don't consider it native to Illinois, but it's in Missouri and other places, and it's fairly widespread. You can buy it in cultivation, and it has these flowers. If you can see the size of the hand down here, it's a large flower. It flowers at night, primarily. They will open flowers late afternoon. But this is one plant by my driveway. And this has 14 flowers on it. And each flower just lasts a day, one night. And then they're gone. You see the old flowers on there as well. And it flowered like this for a month. Think of how many flowers that plant produced. It's just striking. And they have they big fruits like this, angled fruits. This was taken at the Idea Garden, right at the northwest corner of the Idea Garden, with the big fruits like that. Very nice plant. There are also baptisias, wild indigos. This is the one on the right, the white flowered one you find in prairies. Beautiful plant. I just love the way that plant looks when it comes up and the leaves arch over the surrounding prairie. It attracts bees. You can see in the center picture down here in the corner, you see the bees. Now on the right here, this is blue wild indigo, which is naturalized in Illinois from cultivation. Probably, I don't consider it native to Illinois. A few people do. This is near the new planting on the south side of the new business school and the U of I campus. And it's a very beautiful plant. It's very nice in cultivation. The white one that we see here just has one plant, one flowering stalk. These have many flowering stalks per plant, so the plant's branch. And so it's really quite beautiful. It attracts bees. There are many cultivars of that blue wild indigo. We do have a yellow one native in Iroquois County, Illinois, that's been rediscovered, a yellow baptisia like this. They have been hybridized and selected in various ways. This one is called lemon meringue, and that was growing at the edge of my driveway prairie. But it didn't last but a couple of years, but I gave my daughter a plant of this, and she lives in Normal, and it's been doing just fine for her. Now, there are hybrids. A person at the Chicago Botanic Garden, Jim Alt, plus others have been hybridizing. Baptisia is hybridized in the wild whenever you get them together. And he's been selecting hybrids that he's deliberately made. And this is one called Prairie Blues. And it's a hybrid between the blue one and a different species that's native to Illinois, the cream baptisia. And I had this growing by my driveway prairie. I didn't like it. It was ugly, I thought. It wasn't a very pretty plant. So I dug it up and I just stuck it in a corner next to the oak leaf hydrangea. It's gorgeous. And so you don't have a problem with plants. When do you get rid of a plant? And sometimes you just, if it doesn't grow well, just get rid of it. Sometimes, well, this one I didn't like, but I stuck in a corner and it turned out to be a very attractive, pretty plant. Purple and white prairie clovers, Don Gardner's prairie there you see, and it's a beautiful plant. It goes well with others, many prairie species. This is one that is so fun. Jack, you want to talk about the aesthetics over here?
Yeah. Something that I really like about the purple prairie clover is how wispy their little leaves are. They almost look like little evergreen trees. And just another fun fact, the leaves smell really good. They're very aromatic. They almost smell edible, kind of like a spicy vegetable. And they're also just wonderful for bees, both species.
Now this is Rattlesnake Mastereryngium yuccifolium, because the leaves are like a yucca plant, but it's actually in the same plant family as carrots. And it's growing along with the grasses you see there, and also blazing stars. And it is such a striking plant because it just looks so different than any other plant that you would see in a prairie. So Jack, you want to say some more here?
Yeah. This is just something that you would expect to see in a desert. And I really think that this is one where pictures don't do it justice. I'll always remember my first time running into this plant when I was 12 years old. And I was like, what is this plant? It's so bizarre and striking looking, very beautiful foliage, and something you would expect to see like in Arizona in terms of its aesthetics. I
remember vividly the first time I saw this plant. My advisor at the University of Kansas was the chairman of the botany department, and he hired me one summer to go out and collect some plants on the West Campus, which is now fully developed. But there was the University of Kansas on a limestone escarpment, and he sent me out to collect plants. And I say there was in a prairie, and I saw this plant, and gosh, is it a monocot? Is it a dicot? Is it an umbel? I had no idea when there was a copperhead growing right with the plant. So I remember this plant quite well. Another nice plant, and these photographs don't do justice to this. This is Culver's root, which is 3 or 4 feet tall, and it's a beautiful, beautiful plant. It attracts lots of pollinators, and it has these nice leaves that are in clusters that, it's called a whorled leaf at the bottom like this. It's a really attractive plant. It's commonly cultivated in England as a specimen plant, because you can plant these just as a specimen and they look very attractive like that. One thing you do have to be careful for is that there are species of this in Eastern Asia. And so they've hybridized our native plant here with those of Eastern Asia, and they produce a lot of cultivars. But Jack, you can buy this readily, right?
This is one that you can buy as a straight native prairie species. Yeah, definitely. Everywhere.
Highly recommended. And obedient plant. This is a lovely plant that you find in prairies. It loves to be pollinated by bees here. So I was very fortunate out at Porter Family Park in southwest Champaign. There's a nice planting of these in the driveway oval there. And watching the bees come in to land on these flowers like that. And so it's a lovely plant. It makes a nice specimen plant, especially the cultivated varieties. The wild type as many of these prairie plants, if you buy the wild types, they can get too tall and flop over because they're used to being supported by the texture of a mature prairie. But there are cultivars of this. There's a white cultivar, one called Crystal White Peak, and there's another one called Vivid, which has deeper flowers than this. They make nice specimen plants. They're nice in a prairie too. So it's a really nice plant. Oh, bee balm, it's everywhere. You can buy lots and lots of bee balm. There are many cultivars of bee balms. You can get the straight species as well that you see here like that. But there's lots of hybrids and cultivars of this that are available. They attract bees, and they have a lovely fragrance to the leaves. I'm going to move on. Here's this, actually, that photograph was taken by Jack, the one on the right. That's near Sunset, west of Springfield.
Yep, that was in Springfield.
Yeah, it's just gorgeous like that. We've talked about all the virtues of butterfly weed, so it's really quite beautiful. Another one that's really good for monarch butterflies, the larvae, is swamp or rose milkweed, Asclepias incarnatum. It has beautiful fall color. There are both white cultivars. The wild type is like this, the rose type like this. They attract lots of pollinators, including this nice, beautiful, big black wasp like this. That wasp also likes a non-native hydrangea that we have growing called Pinky Winky, and it loves that same wasp visits that flowers as well. Here we come to pale cone flower. What can you say? It's just absolutely gorgeous when you see it in a natural prairie like this. It's along the railroad cut at Don's, a new site that Don has on his prairie area. Just there by the thousands and thousands when you go to a prairie. Another favorite prairie is Harlem Hills near Rockford, where you see that like this, or a place Jack has been to is Foley Sand Prairie, and there's beautiful ones like this. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous plant. It's growing it in cultivation. You need to be a little more patient. I guess it does do well in cultivation. I've seen it in some people's yards where you just plant sort of a mass planting of this kind of by itself. It's beautiful with prairie drop seed that you see here. And I've showed you a picture like this earlier where you have prairie drop seed growing. This is in England with a variety of non-native species. The thing with prairie drop seed, with a pale coneflower, you have basically one plant, one flower. You go to purple coneflower, which is ubiquitous in gardens these days. You have purple coneflower, and it does have, the stem branches. You can have one plant, and you can have many, many different flowers. Also, pale coneflower is a fairly short flowering period. The purple coneflower flowers for a long time, and so it's a superior garden plant in many ways. But don't ignore pale coneflower either. And the University of Illinois Trials Garden has had a trial going. This was several years ago, and there's not much of it left right now, unfortunately. The trial's finished. But there's all of these different colors of what the so-called purple coneflower, and you go get them in cultivate. You can buy them, all kinds of these at the garden centers. And I went out one year and I spent a lot of money and I bought, I don't know, quite a few of these different ones, and I planted them all in the garden. They were all gone within 2 or 3 years. They just didn't last. I don't know if other people have had that same situation too, but they didn't last for me. Now, vertical heterogeneity again. If you want to add some vertical heterogeneity, it's difficult to beat prairie dock. Silvium terebinthinaceum. It's a beautiful plant. It has these really large leaves like this. It's very nice as a specimen plant. You know, you maybe have to stake up the flower stalk late in the year, maybe not. I have to, mostly because it tends to lean because of trees in the neighbor's yard. But beautiful, tall large leaves like this. Now, this is one that the University of Illinois tried mass plantings of this on the south side of the business school. And you had these huge clusters of all of these large leaves clustered together. To me, it didn't work very well. I think it's much better appreciated just as a single specimen plant. Now, another Silphium, or related plant, is called cup plant. It's named a cup plant because of the way the leaves come together at the base and form a cup like this. And these can be tall, and Jack and I differ on this one. I have 5 Silphiums in my yard, but I don't have this one. And because it really spreads and becomes a weed in a garden. And at Porter Family Park, the Prairie at Porter Park, this is just a weed in the prairie. I mean, it's nice, but it's really spreading. Now, Jack, you want to tell them your story?
I guess my side is that it's fairly pretty. It makes a nice natural border. And it was awarded a merit award from the British Horticultural Society. So I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't discount it, but it does spread. That's true. It does spread.
I've seen it in gardens in Champaign-Urbana, and I mean in yards and things like that. And I am a botanist. I'm not a horticulturalist at all. I like having interesting plants in my yard. I don't know how to group them together necessarily. And I knew a friend was a senior person within the Royal Horticultural Society. So I've been in the Royal Horticultural Society, a member for them like 30 years now or more. And they award these Garden of Merit plants. But you have to remember they're in a very different situation in England. I'm laughing because they just awarded in October Award of Merit to brown-headed coneflower.
Brown-eyed Susan, right?
Brown-eyed Susan, thank you, Jack. Brown-eyed Susan. I'm laughing because it seeds everywhere. And it's a nice plant. I like having it. It'd be nice having it in your garden, but just be prepared for it coming up all over the place. Now, goldenrods, getting closer to the end here. Goldenrods are really nice plants. They have a bad reputation in this country because people think they cause allergies, but they don't cause allergies. They just have the misfortune of flowering at the same time, or the fortune, for however you look at it. They flower at the same time as ragweed. Ragweed causes hay fever. These do not. These are insect-pollinated plants, and this is showy goldenrod, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous plant. I have it in my front yard. It attracts all kinds of insects to it, as you see here. Beautiful fall color like that. And, well, we have snow, right? And it's really quite beautiful with the snow collecting on the seed heads of this as well. It's a beautiful plant. Highly recommended. This is another goldenrod. This is a cultivar of Solidata rugosa, or the rough goldenrod, and it's a cultivar called Fireworks, and you can see why, because the flower heads just come up and explode over these beautiful, graceful things. And this is available. I got 2 or 3 plants at two plants at Prairie Gardens a couple of years ago. This is right behind this beautiful patch is right behind the State University Retirement Systems on Fox Drive in Champaign. And at the back, on the west side of it, there's a sidewalk trail that goes along called the Burwash Trail, I think. And this is just growing right behind Sirs there. Beautiful, beautiful plant. It's interesting. These have smaller flowers than this goldenrod. And so you look at I'm not an insect person at all, unfortunately, but these have very different insects visiting the two different kinds of goldenrods. We've mentioned blazing stars again. These are beautiful blazing stars. You can buy lots of different cultivars of blazing stars in garden centers, and I would generally recommend buying a cultivar over one of the native true species, simply because the true ones will grow too tall and fall over. The cultivars will stay shorter. Now, both Jack and I have heard that when you grow blazing stars in a garden, voles will often eat the underground. It's not really a bulb, but the corm. They will eat the corm. And I don't know if you've heard the same thing, right, Jack?
Yeah. And I've had trouble getting these to last long in my garden. I do think the corms are very tempting in the winter for a lot of little critters.
Yes, I think so too. But it's still worth trying, and they're really beautiful to see. One of these species, Liatris pycnostachi, is often grown as a cut flower these days. You can go into a flower shop or a supermarket where there's a flower section. You often find they're growing these, I think, primarily in the Netherlands or something, as a cut flower. Getting to grasses, finally, the end. And grasses, what can you say about prairie dropseed? I mean, it's just a beautiful, gorgeous plant, grass. It's wispy and diffuse, is like Jack likes, as you see with the texture of it like this. But yet it's refined and it's defined, because like purple lovegrass, it's very undefined, but you can tell one prairie dropseed plant. And they're best planted when you have the space 2 or 3 or so feet apart, or 3 feet probably preferable if you give them enough time. Let them grow and develop like this, and then you can grow all kinds of other prairie plants in between them like this. And so they're beautiful, just a beautiful grass, and it is commonly cultivated. You can buy it in your garden center. Have you ever seen a cultivar, Jack? I don't think I have.
There are cultivars, but I think this is a rare native species, just because like people will sell the native version more commonly than the cultivars. And I'll see the native version of this in like McDonald's parking lots. Like, it is a very popular native grass, and it's just kind of stands on its own. It's so pretty.
Yes, it's beautiful fall color. Yeah, it's beautiful fall color. It is really a lovely, lovely plant. Another grass, we're not talking about the big grasses that you see. Think of prairie big blue stem, little blue stem, and Indian grass, switchgrass. Yeah, those are commonly cultivated, I guess. We're talking about others that do better in a garden situation. Another is Sidotes grama. The Latin name is Butulua curtipendula. And there was a fellow on staff at the Missouri Botanical Garden when I was there that just loved to say Butulua curtipendula. And he wrote an article about it, all about what a beautiful name it was. But it's a beautiful plant, too. It has these small, fine inflorescences on it. And if you see the individual flowers like this, there's a lot of this planted at Porter Park, for instance, in Champaign. But you see these anthers coming out, shedding pollen. And it's really a beautiful, attractive plant. And Jack has talked earlier about purple lovegrass. This is at Missouri Botanical Garden here outside the herbarium building, the glass herbarium building there. Just a nice wisp like this that you see. And this was actually at the Art Museum in Indianapolis. It's this nice, beautiful purple lovegrass. It's a lovely grass. It's best planted with a lot of individual plants together like that. To close, I'm showing you a plant that's just gorgeous, but you can't have it. Because you want to tell them why, Jack?
Well, this is a species that you can't really purchase in cultivation. There are a couple specialized nurseries that sell this as seed, but despite the beauty of this, and I'm sure I would love to have this in my garden, you basically can't buy it in cultivation because it's just too difficult to grow. So there are species out there that you just have to appreciate in nature, unfortunately, and this is one of them, the downy gentian.
And they just love it. And this is the reason you can't is it takes, Don Gardner has a lot of this in his Prairie Restoration, which he started in 1974. And he added an addition to in 2001 and 2002 and introduced seed. And it was 10 years from seed to getting the plants to flower, basically like that. And so it's not commercially viable to do that, but it's a beautiful plant. Well, anyway, that's the end of our talk as such. Jack, you want to talk a little bit about availability of plants?
Yeah, and just to reiterate, and I've kind of said this throughout the talk, many native species that you would be interested in are available somewhere. And if anyone wants help finding something very particular, you could feel free to reach out to me. But here's a couple ones. We're not like endorsing financially. We're just saying that like there are local native plant societies like the Grand Prairie Friends here in Champaign that have native plant sales. Prairie Moon Nursery is very, very, very diverse, and you can find a lot of native plant species there in some form or another. And then there are even like more local nurseries such as Piso, which is a wholesaler that sells like local Illinois seed and eco-type plants. So just keep in mind that if you're interested in native plants, there is a market for them and you can find them.
I know I looked to the website for Piso just before the talk went on, and they have if you go to their website, Piso Native Plant Nursery, he's a U of I grad, incidentally, Jack Piso is, but there's a site that says our retail partners or something, so you can you can go to a link there on that web page to find out some places that sell. Most of our local nurseries, garden centers do have a section on native plants, and certainly our ones here in Champaign-Urbana do, and I know I've seen in Bloomington, other places in Bloomington, Illinois, the same, where they'll have a section on native plants that are there as well. And plus, often you just buy native plants or cultivars in the regular section at garden centers like that. Now then, there are, the Champaign County Forest Preserve District does have a web page about native plants. I'm going to scroll through these quickly. You won't be able to write them all down. Some sources you can go back and get these URLs later, but they have a section on native plants, and they have PDF files that you can download about native shrubs or prairie forbs, all those things. And they have lists that you can download a PDF file about native grasses or prairie forbs or woodland forbs for landscaping as well. The University of Illinois Extension and other people have put together a series of little booklets. They're not really a booklet. It's just folded sheets of four total pages, and they have 5 of them all together. And Illinois native plants and pollinator gardens and woodland gardens and wet woodland gardens and rain gardens or something. You can download these. It's a little bit. You can get hard copies, but I would suggest getting a PDF because you can enlarge the PDF because the images are really small on the inside. But this is where you can download 2 of them, or you can probably call your local extension office and they can give you either URLs or refer them to places. This is another page. The University of Illinois Extension has a section on native plants, and it's quite well. This particular section came out of the Chicago area, but you can go to that web page and get more information too. Okay, so that's the end of the PowerPoint. Are we back?
Yeah, Ken, Jack, thank you so much for that. That was awesome. You know, it's February 18th, but I'm already itching, probably much like everybody watching, and maybe you too as well, for it to get warmer, so we can get out there and appreciate these native plants, and especially on our own properties. You know, I've got my favorites. You know, I love seeing the Virginia bluebells. We have some really pretty patches that just cover the landscape at like the Woods Forest Preserve near the Sangamon River and the red covered bridge. There's also some really pretty patches at Hidden Acres close to Homer Lake Forest Preserve. So that's probably one of my favorites that you mentioned. But I'm also interested. I love the story of the stories that both of you shared about the Rattlesnake Master. I got to get my eyes on one of those, so because I've never seen one before myself. But sounds like you two had some pretty interesting experiences with them as well. So if you guys wouldn't mind, would you guys mind answering a few questions for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been writing stuff down too as I've been.
Oh, sure. So we've had some questions come in the comment section. If you have a question, I'll go ahead and write it down below if you haven't done so already. But I'm just going to sort through. We unfortunately won't have time to get to all these questions, I don't think, but try and find some here and there. Let's see. Benjamin has a question here. He asked towards the beginning of the presentation, using native Rs, I think is what he meant to say, instead of true wild strains. Is there an impact on the insect fauna's ability to use them?
There's been a lot of research about this, and this is a question that I wrote down and wanted to talk about because nativars are like a really big topic that I think there's not as much research on that there probably should be. From my understanding of the literature, the more transformed a cultivar becomes, generally the less valuable it is to pollinators, but nativars still can have a lot of value for insect pollinators. And I have looked at research, and I want you and anyone interested in this topic to look up Mount Cuba Center. The Mount Cuba Center in Delaware specifically studies native plant cultivars and how they're valuable for like biodiversity and their performance. So I don't want to be a cop-out and not answer the question, but the answer to this is it depends, and it's complicated, and it's still kind of up in the air. But my specific answer would be if you are gardening for biodiversity purposes, the native form rule of thumb is probably going to be better because Ken has showed examples of like coneflowers and hydrangeas that may not even produce pollen or nectar because they're so weird and transformed. So hopefully that answers the question okay. But again, Mount Cuba Center, and there is research on this that has been done by some people. And another one is I think someone named Abigail White in Vermont had a thesis about this. There's research being done about this, but it is.
The closer that you get, the highly selected cultivars are not going to be nearly as good. An example, we didn't talk about sunflowers, but there's a lot of sunflowers around, and people grow sunflowers for two basic reasons. One of them is for pollinators to get the seed, and then you get seed for wildlife like this. And the other people grow sunflowers for cut flowers, the big sunflowers for cut flowers. And if you go to a garden center, you're going to see two kinds of packets there. One will say it's pollenless. And if you're in your garden and you want to grow it for pollinators, you don't want to buy one of these sunflowers that is grown for cut flowers. It'll say pollenless on it. And so that is important. And you don't want to do double flowered ones. For many of the prairie plants, the cultivars are closer to the native species than many plants. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. What do you think, Jack? I don't know if it's true or not.
In terms of what do you mean exactly?
Well, I'm just thinking something like Physostegia and maybe some of the Monardas. So those are still good for pollinators, even though they're cultivars or something.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer I tell people is pure natives, nativars, then non-native plants. That's kind of the hierarchy that makes sense to me. It is more nuanced than that, but that's kind of the rule of thumb if you're talking about biodiversity value with respect to pollinators and insects.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jack and Ken. Another question. Angie asks, can you collect seeds and start plants easily from wild woodland flowers, particularly the wild geranium, which grows along the country road I live on? So seed collection. Possibly.
Woodland wildflowers are kind of notoriously difficult to cultivate from seed. I don't know about wild geranium in particular. A lot of times these woodland wildflowers have a difficult germination requirement where they have to be tricked into thinking they've gone through multiple winters in order to germinate. Check Prairie Moon Nursery for their germination code because wild geranium in particular may be fairly easy to grow from seed. I don't have experience with it. But a lot of these like woodland ephemerals we've talked about, like Bloodroot is a good example. That would be really difficult to cultivate from seed. You would have to be very patient.
Yeah, with wild geranium, I don't know about germination, but they're really neat. I mean, you could certainly try it if it's growing along the roadside, but you'd have to be careful because it's called a crane's bill too, or related to crane's bills. And they have a fruit that looks kind of like a crane's bill, but the seeds are down at the bottom and you have this long rostrum at the top, the styles. And when this is mature, these spring back. There's 5 parts that will spring back like this. Now, some people say that they explode, in which case you need to collect them just before that and put them in a sack. I was writing a paper about geraniums many, many years ago, a scientific paper, and I went out there and I just sat and watched them in the evening, and they just slowly opened when I was watching, and then they slowly opened, and the seeds were still contained in those, and then they squeezed together and spit the seeds out. So anyway, you need to collect them early. You could try it. It's just fun to watch them anyway.
Thank you, too. I got a question. Ken, you use the term vertical heterogeneity quite a bit. Could you describe what that is?
Go for it, Jack.
Okay. And it probably sounds a little fancier than we mean. So vertical heterogeneity is just this idea that there are different types of structures of the prairie plants. So if you ever open up a textbook about rainforest, for example, you have a tall overstory, a subcanopy, and then things on the bottom on the herbaceous layer. And similarly, prairie plants aren't as big as rainforests, obviously, but you have some species which are really tall and vertical, and then you have other species which are short and sprawling. And when you have very diverse prairie communities, you have this like interplay of these different forms of plant growth and structure. And if you look at it vertically, you see that there's a lot of differences between the individual plants and the species. And Ken and I just find that very interesting. And from an aesthetic standpoint and an ecological standpoint too, is that's what we need.
If you go to a native prairie, or a really good high quality restoration or a prairie project like Don Gardner, but if you go to a really good native prairie or something like a place like Don's, or the Doris Westfall Prairie over in south of Danville and Forest Glen, you see this vertical heterogeneity where you have plants that come up early in the spring. I mean, in a prairie, you start with plants that are very short and low to the ground, the species that grow there. Then they grow and develop and they flower, they set seeds, and then another suite of species that come in that are taller. And you just go through this sequence of different species. And so when you go to a high quality prairie, you see this sequence of different species flowering over time. And that results in this vertical heterogeneity. You move to a restoration, mostly all you're going to see is the fall flowering stuff, the big grasses. And so you lack this. And so it's an indication of how high a quality a site that you're at when you're dealing with prairie plants.
Thank you for that. Maybe got time for one more question here to finish it up. So question being asked, if you could suggest one plant that you wish everyone would plant to help biodiversity, bees, butterflies, etc., what would it be? What do you think?
We're both looking at the ceiling, I see.
That's a tough one. I guess it's an awesome question, but you need multiple species in order to like provide for pollinators broadly. But if I had to pick one, I think goldenrods are great.
That's the one I would pick, goldenrod.
Oh, we agree then? Because they have these really shallow flowers, which any type of pollinator can use. It flowers late in the year when a lot of things need a lot of resources. And yeah, it seems like pollinators just love them. But
we didn't talk about New England aster because there's so many cultivars and things available of New England aster. It's kind of weedy. But if you combine goldenrod and New England asters, it works really well.
Someone in the comments said butterfly weed, and I think that's my number 2 is butterfly weed. And it really is impossible to pick one, I think. But if I had to, I guess it'd be those 2.
Tough choice. Yeah. Well, Ken and Jack, thank you so much for the presentation. Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight too. Got some folks saying thank you in the comments. Linda says thank you so much from Michigan. This has been very informative. Got other folks saying thank you very much. Angie says thank you. Sarah says thank you, and it also includes a little butterfly emoji, which is nice. Kate says thank you. Ed. Also saying goldenrods are excellent. So we got agreement there. Deborah saying thanks. Again, thank you so much, Ken, Jack, for the presentation. I think if I wasn't already, like I said before, looking forward to the warmer weather, I think I am now after tonight. So really appreciate all the images that you showed, and especially your knowledge range too. For both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And everybody watching, hope you can tune in to some future programs, as I mentioned at the beginning, and check out our websites and social media pages for more information. But with that, I'm going to end the live broadcast, and until next time.